In the spring of 1945, the war in Europe was ending, but not for everyone. Across the shattered continent, trains and trucks carried prisoners, soldiers and civilians from one defeated nation to another. Among them were a group of German women prisoners of war, their faces pinholed beneath the grime of exhaustion. They had been captured on the Western Front, accused of aiding the German army, and were now being transferred to an unknown location somewhere in Britain. The journey was silent. The only sound was the rattling of the truck's wheels and the distant crows circling the countryside. Each woman sat with her hands folded, their minds replaying the warnings they had heard before leaving Germany. The British will make you pay. They hate us. You will never return. Those words echoed like a curse. As the vehicle crossed into a small English village, the tension inside the truck grew heavier. No one dared to speak. The guard at the back sat with a rifle across his knees, his face expressionless. The women thought of their families, their cities in ruins, and the unknown future waiting beyond the camp gates. One of them, Helene, a nurse from Hamburg, tried to steady her breathing. She told herself this would be no different from captivity anywhere else, cold, cruel, and full of humiliation. But something deep inside her whispered a different fear, a question she couldn't silence. What if they don't treat us as prisoners at all? What if it's worse? What if they simply ignore us, as if we don't exist? The truck slowed down. The engine coughed, then settled into a quiet rumble. Outside, a few villagers had gathered by the roadside. Men in dusty coats, women with scarves over their hair, children holding onto their hands. Helene kept her eyes low. She could feel the stares burning through the wooden slats. The women had been told that British civilians despised Germans, that they would spit, shout, maybe even throw stones. She waited for it, the anger, the hatred. But the silence that followed was different. It wasn't cold, it wasn't hateful. It was curious. Then came a sound Helene didn't understand. A faint murmur, soft at first, then clearer. Laughter, children's laughter. She looked up just once through the narrow opening in the truck wall, and what she saw made her heartbeat stop for a second. The villagers, the British civilians, weren't shouting. They were waving. A child lifted his arm and smiled, as if greeting travellers, not prisoners. A woman beside him nodded gently, her eyes filled not with hate, but something closer to pity, or maybe kindness. Helene froze. Her throat tightened. None of the German women spoke, but in that shared silence, every single one of them felt the same question rise in their hearts. Why? Why would the enemy wave at them? The truck kept moving, the sound of its engine blending with the faint echoes of those unexpected waves, a sound that would haunt Helene for the rest of her life. Because at that moment, she realised something was wrong. Something didn't fit the world she thought she knew. That night, the air inside the temporary camp was thick with confusion. The captured women sat in a dimly lit barracks, an old stone building with leaking roofs and the faint smell of smoke. The fire crackled weakly in a metal drum, but no one dared to speak above a whisper. They weren't talking about the cold or the guards. They were talking about what they had seen. Helene sat near the fire, rubbing her hands together for warmth. Her mind wouldn't stop replaying that strange moment, those villagers smiling and waving as if greeting friends. Every instinct told her it made no sense. Had the British lost their minds? Or was this some kind of cruel game, a trick to make them drop their guard? Across from her, another woman, Clara, muttered under her breath. "They must be mocking us," she said. "Didn't you see the way they smiled? They hate us. They want us to think they don't." Helene didn't answer. She wanted to believe that, but deep down, something about those faces felt genuine. It was the eyes, calm, tired, but gentle, eyes that had seen war, perhaps too much of it, and still chose not to hate. Outside, a guard's boots echoed along the corridor. The women fell silent. The sound was heavy, measured, like a clock ticking through fear. When the door creaked open, every back straightened instinctively. But the British guard who stepped inside didn't shout. He simply nodded and placed a pot of steaming tea on the table before leaving again. No one moved. The steam rose in delicate swirls, filling the cold room with the scent of something warm, almost comforting, but no one dared to touch it. Clara whispered again. "Poison," she said. "They're testing us." Helene's hands trembled, but then she remembered the child, that wave, that simple human gesture. Slowly, carefully, she picked up one of the tin cups and poured the tea. It tasted of smoke and leaves, bitter, but real, and nothing happened. The others watched in disbelief. For the first time in days, they weren't being shouted at, they weren't being punished, they were being treated like people. But for women who had been taught that enemies were monsters, that kindness from the enemy was impossible, this simple act of decency became terrifying in its own way, because kindness was unpredictable. Helene couldn't sleep that night. Every sound outside made her flinch. She feared that the morning would bring the cruelty they were expecting, that the waves, the tea, the quiet voices were all part of a setup. As dawn crept through the cracks in the roof, she sat awake, staring at the faint light spreading across the floor. Somewhere outside, she heard the laughter of children again, faint but unmistakable, and that's when the thought struck her. What if this wasn't a trap? What if this was who they really were? The idea scared her even more than the war itself, because if the enemy could show kindness, then everything she had believed about the world, about loyalty, about hate, was suddenly in question. Morning broke cold and grey. Mist hung over the fields beyond the camp fence, swallowing the horizon in a pale, ghostly blur. For a moment the world seemed still, as if the war itself had paused to take a breath. The women were called outside for roll call. The British Guards stood in line, silent, their breath forming faint clouds in the cold air. Their uniforms were neat, their boots polished, their eyes steady, but not cruel. Helene stood in the front row, her heart thudded quietly beneath her worn coat. Every instinct told her to avoid eye contact, to keep her head low, to be invisible. But then she noticed something that unsettled her even more than hostility would have. One of the British soldiers, a young man, barely older than 20, was looking at her, not with suspicion, but with something like sympathy. He nodded faintly, almost like an acknowledgement. Helene looked away immediately, her pulse quickening. Why was he doing that? Why was there no hate in his eyes? After roll call, the prisoners were given orders. They were to walk to a nearby field where they would help with the farm work under civilian supervision. The idea itself seemed absurd to them. Back home, they'd been told that British civilians despised Germans, that no English farmer would ever allow an enemy to walk freely through his land. And yet, here they were. The gate opened. The guards motioned them forward. The women stepped outside, their boots crunching against the frost-covered ground. The village was just beyond the hill. Smoke rose gently from chimneys, and the faint smell of bread drifted through the air. That simple, homely scent that reminded them painfully of everything they'd lost. As they reached the edge of the village, something changed in the air. Doors opened, curtains shifted, faces appeared. British faces. Men and women who had lived through bombings, rationing and fear. People who had lost their sons to the same war these German women had fought in. Helene's breath caught in her throat. She felt their eyes on her. Every step became heavier. Her stomach twisted. She expected the shouting to begin. She braced herself for the hatred that surely must come now. But then it happened again. From across the road, an elderly man lifted his cap and waved. A simple, gentle gesture. Nothing mocking about it, just human. A small boy beside him did the same, smiling shyly before his mother pulled him close, whispering something that made him grin even wider. The German women froze mid-step. None of them spoke. None of them moved. Helene could feel the tears burning behind her eyes, though she didn't know why. She didn't understand what she was feeling. Confusion, guilt, fear, or something far more fragile. Hope. The guards noticed the hesitation. One of them, a middle-aged British sergeant, cleared his throat softly. "Carry on," he said, his tone calm, almost gentle. The women continued walking, their steps uneven now, as if every part of them wanted to turn around and look again, to make sure what they'd seen was real. Helene whispered under her breath, "Why would they wave? We are the enemy." But deep down, another voice inside her, quiet, uncertain, whispered back, "Maybe not anymore." As they reached the fields, the village slowly disappeared behind them. But that image of strangers waving at them with kindness stayed. It lingered like a shadow they couldn't shake, a mystery that refused to fade. They didn't know it yet, but that small wave was only the beginning. Something far greater and far more unsettling was about to unfold. The field stretched far beyond the village, rolling hills of damp soil glistening under the pale English sun. The morning fog clung low to the ground, and every sound, the rustle of boots, the faint bleating of sheep, seemed amplified in the stillness. The women were handed tools and pointed toward the rows of farmland where crops had been left unattended. It was simple work, clearing weeds, gathering potatoes, cutting dry stalks, but every motion felt heavy under the weight of watchful eyes. British civilians stood at a distance. Some were farmers, others villagers helping to rebuild what the war had taken. They were the very people these women believed would hate them most. Helene kept her head down, hands trembling as she reached for the earth. The cold soil bit at her skin, but she didn't complain. The silence between captor and captive was louder than words, a silence built on history, on grief, on too many dead faces that neither side could forget. But then something unexpected broke that silence. A shadow fell over Helene's hands. She looked up, and there stood an elderly British farmer holding a small bucket. His face was lined, weathered by years of work and war. Without a word, he knelt beside her and began pulling the weeds himself. Helene froze. She didn't know whether to move or speak. The guard watching from afar made no attempt to stop him. The old man glanced at her once, then muttered, "No need to do it alone, lass. Soil's the same for all of us." The old man glanced at her once, then muttered, "No need to do it alone, lass. Soil's the same for all of us." The words were quiet, but they hit like thunder. For the first time, Helene heard English not as a soldier's command, but as a human voice. Soft, unguarded, real. She wanted to respond, but the words caught in her throat. The man didn't wait for an answer. He stood, dusted off his hands, and walked back toward his cart. As the day went on, more small moments like that began to unfold. A farmer's wife brought out a jug of water and passed it to the guards, who without hesitation handed it to the German women first. A child waved from a distant gate, and one of the younger prisoners, against every instinct, waved back. It wasn't supposed to be like this. For years these women had been told they were monsters, the cause of everything the British had lost. They had been warned that capture meant humiliation, revenge, even death. But here, in this quiet corner of Britain, none of that seemed true. By midday, Helene found herself glancing toward the village more often than she should. Every time she did, she caught sight of someone watching from a window. Not with hatred, but with quiet curiosity, almost empathy. It was terrifying, because kindness was harder to survive than cruelty. As they returned to the camp at dusk, the women whispered among themselves. Some still believed it was all an act, a mask hiding something darker, but others, like Helene, were beginning to feel something else, something they didn't know how to name. Maybe it was guilt, maybe it was longing, or maybe it was the faint, impossible glimmer of forgiveness. That night, when Helene closed her eyes, she saw the farmer's face again and heard his voice echoing in the dark. Soil's the same for all of us. It haunted her, not because it was cruel, but because it was true. And somewhere deep inside, she began to realise that this small village, this enemy land, might not destroy her. It might change her. Rain had come in the night. By morning the fields were soaked, soft mud clinging to the prisoners' boots as they marched out beneath low clouds. The sky hung heavy and colourless, and the air smelled of wet grass and smoke from cottage fires far away. Helene's group worked close to the lane that led into the village. Every sound, the crows, the wind, the squelch of boots, felt sharpened by the drizzle. The women kept their heads down. They still didn't know how far the British tolerance would reach. Would one mistake, one wrong word, turn these gentle gestures into fury? Around mid-morning, a small wagon appeared on the road. The guard called a warning, and the women stepped back automatically. The wagon stopped beside them. A figure climbed down, an elderly British woman wrapped in a grey shawl, her white hair pinned neatly under her hat. She carried a wicker basket covered with cloth. No one moved. Even the guards seemed unsure what to do. The old woman's face was kind but unreadable. She spoke softly, her accent thick and warm. "You'll take cold out here. Have this." She set the basket on the ground and opened the cloth. Inside were apples. Red, shining, perfect. The colour looked unreal against the grey mud. For a heartbeat, no one breathed. The German women stared as if the fruit were a trap. The guard looked at the woman and hesitated, then gave the smallest nod. Helene stepped forward. She could feel her pulse hammering in her neck. Every memory of warning screamed in her head. Don't accept anything from them. It's a trick. It's humiliation. Still, her hand moved. She picked up one apple. It was cold and smooth, still damp from the rain. The old woman smiled faintly. "Go on, love. They're just apples." Helene bit into it. The taste was sharp and sweet, bursting after months of bitterness. She felt tears sting her eyes before she could stop them. Around her, the other prisoners began to take apples one by one, their suspicion breaking like ice under sunlight. Some laughed, quietly, uncertainly, like people remembering they were human. The old woman didn't stay. She simply lifted her shawl against the wind and said, almost to herself, "War ends sooner when we remember we're people." Then she walked away down the lane. When the guards ordered the women back to work, no one spoke. The rain had stopped. The sound of birds returned to the hedges, and inside every woman there was a new, confusing ache, a mix of gratitude and shame. Helene kept turning the apple core in her hands. She thought of her home, of her mother, of the British child who had waved at her days ago. None of it fit with what she had been taught to believe about enemies. That night, back in the barracks, she hid the apple seeds in a scrap of cloth. When Clara asked why, Helene whispered, "Because something good should grow from this place." The other women didn't laugh. They understood. And in that fragile silence, for the first time, they felt a spark of something stronger than fear. The possibility that mercy was real. By dawn the next morning, something had changed in the camp. It wasn't spoken, not even whispered. But everyone felt it. A faint shift in the air, as if the weight pressing down on them had lifted just a little. The guards noticed it first. The women lined up more quietly than usual, their eyes less hollow. When the roll call ended, a few of them even murmured quiet thank yous when given their tools, a sound that startled the British sergeant more than any disobedience ever could. Helene walked among them, clutching the small scrap of cloth that held her apple seeds. She didn't know why she'd kept them. Maybe it was foolish, maybe even dangerous, but something about them felt important, as if they represented a promise no one had dared to make aloud. That morning, as they marched back toward the same fields, the mist hung lower than usual, curling around their legs like ghostly fog. And through that fog, the village began to stir again, doors opening, distant voices calling out, the clatter of milk pails and cartwheels. The British civilians were watching, not with fear, not even with anger, but with quiet curiosity, like people trying to understand what an enemy really looked like when the shooting stopped. Halfway through the day, another cart appeared on the road. This time it wasn't apples, it was loaves of bread, fresh and warm, wrapped in brown paper. The guards exchanged glances, unsure whether to intervene. Then one of the older farmers stepped forward, nodding toward the German women. "They can have the leftovers, he said simply. "No harm in that." No harm. The phrase lingered in Helene's ears like an echo. The women divided the bread carefully, each piece shared between trembling hands. They ate in silence, not out of fear, but because the moment felt too sacred for words. The crust was crisp, the inside soft, the smell almost unbearable in its simplicity. And somewhere, as they chewed, something began to crack deep inside them. Not a wall of resistance, but the armour they'd built around their hearts. Later, while resting near the hedgerow, Helene saw a group of British children playing by the fence. They were skipping stones, laughing, their clothes patched but clean. One of them, a boy with messy blonde hair, pointed toward the prisoners and whispered something. The others hesitated, then began to wave. This time none of the women looked away. A few even lifted their hands in return, shyly, uncertainly. It was a simple exchange, but it meant everything. For the first time, it wasn't pity or curiosity in those British eyes. It was acceptance, however small. The guards pretended not to notice. One of them, a quiet Scotsman, turned slightly and whispered to another, "Maybe they're not what we thought, eh?" The other guard didn't reply, but Helene saw him glance at the women differently afterward, not as captives, but as people caught in the same storm. That evening, back at camp, the women gathered near the stove, sharing the last crumbs of bread and quiet conversation. Someone laughed, a real laugh, soft but alive. It startled them all. For months, they had forgotten what laughter sounded like. Clara looked up and said, "If they can forgive us, maybe we can forgive ourselves." No one answered. But in the flickering light of that small, smoky room, Helene felt something stir, something dangerously close to hope. Outside, the wind rustled through the wire fence, and beyond it, the village lights glowed faintly against the dark. The same lights that had once seemed so distant, so forbidden, now felt like the first stars after a long, endless night. The days began to blend together. Soft grey mornings, quiet labour in the fields, and the slow, strange rhythm of coexistence between prisoners and villagers. Kindness had become a whisper in the air, fragile but persistent. Yet in war, even peace feels dangerous. Helene knew it, the guards knew it, and so did the civilians who, despite their gentle gestures, still hesitated to cross the invisible line that divided enemy from neighbour. Until one afternoon, someone did. The rain had stopped, leaving the fields damp and shining under a brief stretch of sun. The women were stacking bundles of cut wheat near the hedge when Helene heard footsteps on the road. She looked up, and there he was, the same elderly farmer who had worked beside her days before. In his hand, he carried a tin cup and a thermos. He stopped at the fence, resting both items on the wooden post. "Tea," he said simply, in his rough country voice. "Can't be easy out there." The guard watching them, a young corporal named Harris, frowned. "Sir, I can't allow that," he muttered, stepping forward. But the old man didn't move. He kept his eyes on Helene, calm but firm. "It's just tea, lad." Not treason. Helene didn't move either. The steam rising from the cup carried the faint, bittersweet scent of something she hadn't smelled in months. Real tea. Her throat tightened. The corporal hesitated, glancing between the farmer and the prisoner. For a moment, the world seemed to hang still, suspended between rule and mercy. Then, quietly, he turned away. "5 minutes," he said under his breath. Helene reached out through the fence. Her fingers brushed the tin, still warm from the farmer's hands. The first sip scalded her tongue, but she didn't care. The heat, the flavour, the simple humanity of it brought tears to her eyes. The farmer smiled faintly. "My son didn't come back from France," he said softly. "He was your age, maybe younger, but I reckon he'd not want me to hate forever." Helene couldn't speak. She wanted to say, "I'm sorry," but in that moment words felt too small for the weight between them. Before she could reply, Harris cleared his throat. "That's enough," he said, but his voice wasn't harsh. He turned to the farmer and nodded once, a silent thanks, or perhaps apology. As Helene handed the empty cup back, her hands trembled. The farmer tipped his hat and walked away, his figure fading into the light rain that began to fall again. The next day, whispers spread through the camp. Some of the women called her foolish, others brave. A few said she had risked punishment for nothing. But Helene didn't regret it. That cup of tea, small, ordinary, human, had done what no speech or treaty could. It had reminded her that mercy could exist even between those who once tried to destroy each other. That night, lying on her bunk, she couldn't sleep. She kept replaying the farmer's words, the way his voice broke slightly when he mentioned his son. War had taken everything from both of them, yet somehow in that moment they had shared peace. Outside, the rain tapped gently against the barracks roof, soft and rhythmic, like the heartbeat of a world slowly remembering how to be kind again. A message, sent from the regional command office, stamped with the seal of authority and written in sharp, emotionless language. It ordered stricter discipline in all prisoner of war camps, especially those housing German captives. Rumours had reached headquarters, rumours of fraternisation, of unacceptable contact between the prisoners and the local population. The order was clear. Kindness was to be contained. That morning, when the guards read the notice aloud, the camp fell silent. Even the wind seemed to stop. Helene watched as Sergeant Miller, the older British guard who had once allowed the farmers' visits, folded the letter and slipped it into his coat pocket. His jaw was tight, his eyes distant. He didn't look at the prisoners, not directly, but Helene could see the conflict in his face. The man who had once nodded to her in quiet understanding now stood like a statue, trapped between duty and conscience. Later that day, as the women were marched to the fields, the village road was empty. No children waving, no farmers waiting, no bread, no apples, no smiles. It was as if the whole countryside had turned its back overnight. The air felt colder. Every sound, boots on gravel, tools in soil, carried an edge of fear. The women worked in silence, eyes low, afraid to even glance toward the cottages beyond the hedge. Helene's hands shook as she pulled at the earth. Her mind kept returning to the farmer's words, to the warmth of that shared tea, to the tiny spark of hope she had dared to feel. Was it all gone now? Had it all been just a fragile dream? As the afternoon wore on, she saw movement at the edge of the field, a flicker of colour behind a tree. For a moment she thought it was her imagination, but then she saw him, the same elderly farmer, standing far beyond the fence. He didn't approach. He didn't speak. He simply lifted his hand, a brief, subtle wave, and then turned away. It lasted no more than a few seconds, but to Helene it meant everything. That night, tension spread through the barracks like smoke. The guards had been ordered to report any overly familiar behaviour. Punishments would follow if the rules were broken again. Clara whispered in the dark, "They're afraid, not of us, but of peace." No one replied. The rain drummed softly on the tin roof, steady and endless. Helene stared into the shadows, her thoughts a storm. She understood now. Kindness could be as dangerous as cruelty, because kindness made people question the things they had been told to hate. The next morning, as the gates opened once more, Helene carried her small cloth pouch in her pocket, the one with the apple seeds inside. She looked toward the field, toward the place where the farmer had stood. If she couldn't speak to him again, she could still answer him in her own way. That day, while the guards weren't looking, she knelt by the fence and pressed the seeds into the damp English soil. Her hands were trembling, but her heart was steady. Something good should grow, she whispered. No one saw her do it. No one knew what those few seconds meant. But in a war built on hatred, that small act, those tiny seeds, were rebellion enough. Months passed. The world outside the camp was changing. The war, that vast merciless storm that had swallowed nations whole, was finally dying. News arrived slowly, carried by guards who no longer spoke like soldiers, but like men ready to go home. Germany had surrendered. The guns were silent. The skies, for once, were free of bombers. For the first time in years, there was quiet. And yet, for Helene and the others, peace didn't come easily. It was strange, almost frightening to imagine freedom again, to think of walking through gates that had defined their lives for so long. In the camp, the tension began to fade. Orders softened. Guards spoke more kindly. One morning, Sergeant Miller himself read the message that would change everything. "You'll be going home soon," he said. "Arrangements are being made." No one cheered. No one cried. They simply stood there, stunned by the idea that their captivity and this strange coexistence was truly ending. That night, Helene couldn't sleep. The wind outside whispered through the barbed wire like a ghost passing through metal. She rose quietly, slipped her small cloth pouch from beneath her bunk and stepped outside. The guards didn't stop her. The field lay dark and still, touched by moonlight. And there, near the fence, was the spot where she had buried the apple seeds. She knelt down, brushing away the damp earth. And then she saw it. Tiny shoots, fragile and green, pushing up through the soil. She stared for a long time, her hands trembling. It wasn't just growth, it was survival. Life, in a place built for the opposite. She felt something tighten in her chest, not sorrow, not joy, but the deep, aching recognition that humanity had survived the war in small, quiet ways no history book would ever record. Behind her, footsteps approached. It was Sergeant Miller. He stopped a few feet away, watching her. Neither spoke for a moment. Then he said softly, "They'll grow strong, you know. English soil's good for that." Helene looked up, her eyes shimmering in the moonlight. "It's not just English soil," she whispered. "It's ours now too." Miller nodded. Then, almost awkwardly, he reached into his pocket and pulled something out. A folded photograph worn from time. It was of his family, a wife, 2 children smiling in front of a cottage. He handed it to her without a word. She looked at it, then back at him. "You lost someone?" He hesitated, then nodded. "My brother." Normandy. They stood there in silence, 2 people from opposite sides of a war, united by loss, and by something gentler that had survived it. At dawn, the women were loaded onto trucks. The village gathered quietly to watch them go. There were no jeers, no stones, no anger, only the strange stillness of parting. As the truck rumbled past the fields, Helene saw the farmer again. He stood by his gate, hat in hand. When their eyes met, he lifted it slightly, the same gesture he'd made on the first day they met. Helene smiled faintly. This time she waved back without fear. The countryside blurred behind her as they drove away, but in her mind, one image remained. The green shoots in the soil reaching upward toward a sky that no longer echoed with warplanes. Years later, long after the fences had rusted away, a young farmer found an apple tree growing near the edge of that same field. No one remembered who had planted it, but every spring, when the blossoms appeared, the villagers said the same thing. That one came from the year the Germans were here, and when the wind passed through its branches, it carried the quiet memory of something powerful, something small, almost invisible, yet strong enough to outlast the war itself. Not hatred, not vengeance, but mercy.